All right. Um, so hello, welcome. Thank you for joining me. For anybody who is not familiar with us or who may be watching in the community, my name is Courtney. I'm the director of Tapestries, our memory support community here at United Methodist Communities of Pittman. I am a social worker by background. I have a lot of experience in dementia care, but also in mental health and in brain injury. So basically all things brain health related. And that's kind of where, I get my information from and why this is so important to me. And so that said, we're going to hop in. So today we're talking about food and feeding related issues. I know for the families that are joining me, you're kind of in the early stages where you're only starting to maybe see some things or may not be seeing any food related things at all. But there are a lot of changes that happen to our appetite and to our diet as we age, regardless of dementia. And then, of course, dementia throws an extra wrench into the works for a lot of things. So tonight we're going to talk about what those changes are, and then we're going to go through some general tips that might be helpful in supporting your loved one in, maintaining a healthy appetite. And then I'll also go through some things that are specific to different stages of dementia, and we'll kind of go from there. So first and foremost, the things that change as we get older. Oh, we've got a new joiner. Okay. Hi, Beth. Okay. So the first and foremost age-related change is that we tend to have, as we get older, sensory nerve degradation. So that's all of our senses. Our vision tends to get a little worse, our hearing gets a little worse. We tend to maybe lose some sensation in our fingertips, things like that. But where it relates to appetite is that our taste buds stop replacing themselves and stop growing as well. So we have fewer and smaller taste buds. So they tend to be less able to pick up certain sensations. And over time, we can lose some sensations entirely, which makes food obviously much less pleasurable when you can't taste it and you're only going based on how it feels. Also, we can have, because related to that same thing, we have a decreased sense of smell, and there is a ton of overlap as far as how our brains perceive taste and smell together and how that influences our food. So realistically, number one, food just isn't as enjoyable anymore because we can't smell it and taste it as well as we once did. Things start to taste different. And sometimes those changes in the way that we perceive taste can also make the food kind of taste unappetizing. Things might start to seem metallic or bland, or certain foods become purely about texture. Like, I don't know if you've ever eaten an egg while holding your nose, but an egg can be a really lovely experience when you can taste it, but it's a pretty horrifying one when you can't. So
I won't try that.
yeah, no, I don't recommend it. COVID was a lesson for many of us in how miserable food can really be when you can't taste it. And so that's just if you experience that, it's just a small sample of what your older loved ones are going through. Additionally, we produce less saliva. That's partially due to dehydration. Often we don't drink as much as we get older. But it's also just due to the way that our body works. And so saliva is important in helping food transmit the chemicals that create taste to our taste buds, but it's also the beginning of the digestion process. So when we have less saliva, it becomes, again, harder to taste our food, but also it slows the process of beginning to break it down, which makes eating more of a chore. And when we combine that with the fact that digestion in general tends to slow, so that's why you may see your loved ones, maybe they eat breakfast and lunch, but by dinner, they're just like, oh, I'm just stuffed. I'm not hungry, or they eat a much smaller meal later in the day, or maybe they're skipping their middle meal because they just need more time to recover in between. We've all had that Thanksgiving feeling where it's just like there's a brick sitting in your stomach and it seems to take forever to go away. And for a lot of people, as they get older, that can become kind of an everyday experience. Another one is decreased physical activity. we just don't do enough to build up the healthy appetite that we did when we were younger and we were running around and doing all kinds of things, you know, working, taking care of families, running errands, whatever we did for hobbies, all of that. So that definitely has an impact. Depression is extremely common in seniors in general, and appetite loss is, you know, for some of us, appetite loss is a pretty consistent part of depression. Other people experience an increase in appetite, so that one tends to be pretty 50-50. But if your loved one is depressed, that may be contributing to why they're not eating as well. Dentures or missing teeth. So dentures make it a lot harder to eat a lot of certain textures of food, you know, things like apples, carrots, crunchier stuff. Sometimes even chewier things like maybe some of your red meats, you know, more dense proteins can be harder to chew. And if we have mouth pain, you know, maybe we've lost teeth, maybe we haven't gotten dentures, maybe our dentures don't fit properly. You know, maybe we have mouth pain and sensitivity, and then that, you know, complicates the issues even further. And then of course we have medication side effects, which take an impact. So some reduce our appetite right out of the gate, but some also affect the way that food tastes or the way that we experience it. You know, if it causes dry mouth, again, we're having that saliva problem. Certain medications and especially some treatments, so things like chemotherapy, if you have a loved one that's gone through cancer, that'll make food taste very metallic. And so eating becomes a very unpleasant experience, you know, for something like that, but that can also be true with a lot of other medications. And then so when we think about adding dementia into that mix, we also have to consider that there's changes in our loved one's ability to communicate. So part of the barrier to them eating might be that they can't consistently tell us what they want or what's wrong with the food in front of them. So they, you know, maybe what they're thinking is, I really want spaghetti and meatballs, and you've given me, you know, baked chicken and green beans. That's not what I want at all. But they may not be able to express that to us. More so, they may not be able to tell us, this is a little too hot, this is a little too cold, I'd like it heated up, or I need salt and pepper, or, you know, whatever personal preferences may be. So those communication changes make it hard for us to figure out what our loved one truly wants to be able to motivate them to eat. It also makes it very hard for us sometimes to figure out what the problem with the food is if there's food in front of them and they're just not eating it. And it may be something minor, you know, like this toast needs jelly, or, you know, these mashed potatoes need salt. But if they're not able to communicate that to us, are we able, you know, to read between the lines and figure that out? And that can be a challenge. And then we also have to consider changes in functioning. And I specify here not only the intuitive types of changes. So I think when we think about changes in functioning and how that might affect eating, we're thinking, you know, motor skills. Maybe my arthritis is going to make it hard for me to grab the, you know, the fork and knife and to operate them properly. Maybe I'm just forgetting the mechanics of how do I, you know, get the food to my mouth, kind of a thing. But we also have to address other changes that don't kind of make sense with our with appetite, but that still have an impact. So we might have decreased ability to sense that we're hungry. We might have difficulty with decision making that impacts what we choose to eat, or that impacts, once the plate is in front of us, we can get choice anxiety. And if there are 3 or 4 things on a plate, I don't know what to start with, and I'm just not going to start, kind of a thing. And that's not something that we would think about as being a barrier to food. You almost intuitively, you would think having more options would be better, because hopefully they're going to like something on the plate, but that can really have an opposite effect. You know, so there's just a lot more that goes into the process for our loved ones with dementia than we may be cognizant of. Does that make sense? Any questions on any of this? Okay.
Makes sense. Thank you.
Oh, absolutely.
It's just sad.
Yeah.
Sad for them.
Yeah. Well, and I kind of look at it like it's kind of sad for all of us because I don't know about you, but food is a great joy in my life.
That's what I'm thinking. Yeah, it's all part of all your celebrations and things like that. And
Yeah, like it's how you celebrate, it's how you mourn sometimes, it's how
uh,
you socialize and give your day structure. Like it impacts so many different areas of life. And so the thought that regardless of what our senior years look like, that it's going to get a little less enjoyable for all of us is kind of sad, you know.
yeah.
Um,
Oh, well, that was helpful.
well, Linda, you're on mute.
When you said you called it choice, like choice confusion
Oh,
or
yeah, choice anxiety.
choice anxiety, how do you handle a menu? Like if you go out, Mom has a super hard time if she looks at a menu, she just can't make a choice.
Yeah, same here.
Yeah, it's hard. And so it's kind of a funny thing. Because we like to think that more options are better. But even for people with young, healthy brains, choice anxiety is very much a thing that some people experience. And it's basically when there are so many options, there's a tiny nagging part of our brain that's like, don't choose the wrong thing. And then you don't know what to choose. And so basically the way that we handle that is that we're going to reduce the options whenever possible. And so in a restaurant setting, that's kind of difficult. I would suggest if you can review the menu beforehand and maybe limit it to some options that you know Mom historically has enjoyed, then you can just give her, rather than a full page or a full book of options, you can give her, 3 or 4 things that she really likes where she's going to be happy with any of them and try it that way. You might consider adding photos to it so that she has an idea of what the food is going to look like. I know visual choices definitely help when you're in person with someone. And of course, you can't do that at a restaurant. Like, here, this is what your plate looks like. And if you don't like it, we'll grab you something else. But if you can find an approximation, like most chicken parm is going to look like chicken parm kind of a thing, you can attach a photo to it for that. I would prioritize restaurants she's familiar with. And as dementia progresses and our short-term memories become worse, if there are restaurants that were important like long ago, if they're still available, like a family favorite that you went to when you were kids, maybe that helps jog some memory and she already knows what she likes from there, kind of a thing. You can also read the menu to her and just limit it to a couple of options. So there's a lot of ways. If none of that is possible, that's a lot of work, and sometimes it's a run and go kind of a thing. So maybe you stop by, you pick Mom up, you take her out for an appointment, and then you're like, oh, let's stop and get some lunch while we're out. That's not really realistic. Maybe bring some Post-it notes and use that to cover up a chunk of the menu so that her choices are more limited. So there's not all of that visual overstimulation where she's looking at it like, I can't process all of this. That's certainly a quicker and easier kind of solution than when you don't have the ability to prepare ahead of time.
Yeah.
Does that help? Does that make sense?
Yeah. Mom just forgets, I know she historically has loved shrimp. So we went to a restaurant and I said, oh, there's 3 kinds of shrimp. And then she's like, do I like shrimp? She kind of forgot.
Mhm.
So yeah, I guess maybe I should well, she eats most everything. So I guess so it's not a problem. I'm just thinking when she goes out with friends,
Mhm.
when they go out to lunch, if there's like a helpful hint.
Yeah, absolutely.
She's pretty easy she
Yeah.
eats most anything. So I guess that's the best way to do it.
Yeah, she at this stage, she definitely has a healthy appetite and she does not seem to be very particular about what she eats. So I imagine she would be happy with most things. But I would just say if she's going out with friends, give them a guideline of things that she likes. So, she may not remember, but she enjoys shrimp. She enjoys, she really likes pork. She doesn't care for red meat, kind of a thing, and just give them some general guidelines based on
Yeah.
what you know about mom. Because odds are good, like our tastes do change and our personalities do change sometimes as we age. But most of the time, something that was comforting and that she enjoyed is going to continue to be enjoyable. And so you can use what you've seen her order in the past or what you know that she likes and give them, suggestions on where to go. So if she gets overwhelmed, and they can do the same thing, they can take Post-it notes, or they can say, I'm thinking about either the chicken sandwich or the cheeseburger, which one would you get? And if they're only giving two choices, and that's a nice natural way to have that conversation that doesn't kind of put, any, like any discomfort on her, maybe
Right.
it's a little easier that way for her to answer.
Yeah. Good, thank you.
Absolutely. Anybody else, any questions? No? Okay. So then, next we're going to move on to supporting appetite throughout dementia. So these are just general good guidelines, regardless of where our loved one is. I will go through some stuff that's more specific to stages, but we definitely want to start with limiting distractions. So if you've been in some of my other talks, we talk about like complex attention and how it can be really difficult for our loved one with dementia to filter out background noise and distractions and focus on what the task at hand is. And so it might be mealtime, there might be food right in front of them, but if it's a crowded, noisy place, if there's, loud music playing, if, there's whatever going on, that might be a hard thing for our loved one to drown out so that they can focus on the food. And so I can just say from my own experience, like with my grandmother, for example, she struggled with this in her dementia, and nosy was always going to win. You could starve her for days and it would not matter how hungry she was. If you took her to a restaurant and there were people talking at the next table, eavesdropping was going to be more important than whatever that plate in front of her was. And she knew it. Even to the end, she would say, "I've got a nose problem." And that's how she referred to being nosy. But you couldn't take her out to eat without preparing for that, because she was, she was always going to be attending to what's going on around us. So limiting distractions, definitely helpful. Keeping table settings simple. Sometimes when there's a lot, same basic principle, when there's a lot going on the table, it can be hard to kind of block out that visual clutter as well, to focus on the food and to focus on the priority. And particularly when we add in visual, vision changes and visual challenges, that can, be made worse. And that kind of comes hand in hand with the next suggestion, which is whenever possible, we want to use contrasting colors. So, because our vision changes, because our perceptual, words are hard today, because our perceptual abilities change, it can be hard for our loved one to look at the plate and understand what's the plate, what's the food, what's the placemat, that sort of thing. So if we can, instead of patterns, have a solid colored tablecloth or placemat or table, and then have the plate be a separate color, preferably a neutral color, and then have the food be a nice colorful display on top of that, it helps create clear contrast that draws the eye so that our loved one is seeing the food and better able to interact with it. So it kind of helps, we eliminate the clutter on the table, but we also make the table in such a way that it draws the focus to the food, so that there's kind of that visual cue. This is what I'm here for. This colorful plate in front of me, kind of a thing. We need to be mindful of temperature. And this is kind of a strange thing. I think when we think about being mindful of temperature, especially for a loved one who can't communicate, we're more worried about food being too hot. Whether we're serving our elderly loved one or a small child or whatever the case, we tend to think like, oh, I don't want them to put this in their mouth and burn themselves, then they're certainly not going to eat. So we think about hot as being the problem. More often than not, it's actually cold that's the problem, or at least room temperature. So as part of those sensory changes that happen as we age, temperature is also affected. And so hot and cold stick around longer than a lot of those shades of gray in the middle ground. That's why things like soup and ice cream are wildly powerful with seniors. If your loved one will not eat anything else, I guarantee you put a scoop of ice cream in front of them and they're going to eat it. Sweet is one of the sensations that we keep the longest. So the flavor sensations we keep the longest are sweet and salty. So of course, not the ones that are best for our health, but certainly the most enjoyable. So we keep sweet and salty the longest, and we keep hot and cold the longest. So something like ice cream that tends to be sweet and cold is still an enjoyable experience, even when we're struggling with our taste perception. Something like soup that tends to be a little more salty, a little more savory and hot, also enjoyable for that reason. And so if we have a plate of regular food, a dinner plate, a lunch plate, something like that in front of us, we might want to consider if that food is room temperature, they're not really getting anything from it in terms of flavor sensation. And often that's a barrier to eating. We want to make sure that we're being adaptable to changes in preference. So I know for myself, I don't really want to eat the same thing every day. I'll start to get tired of it. I think a lot of us do like that kind of variety. But as we get older, and especially as we progress in dementia, that kind of variety becomes less important. If our goal is to get nutrition in the person and there's a food we know they'll eat, that's the winner. Even if they had it for breakfast and for lunch that day, if that's what they'll eat for dinner, that's okay. We had for a long time a resident that ate peanut butter and jelly sandwiches for every meal because that's what she asked for every meal. It was her favorite food, which is, it seems like kind of a strange one, but this is the Depression era generation and peanut butter and jelly was a treat. So she loved it and she ate it breakfast, lunch, and dinner every day for months. And that sounds awful to me, but it was happiness to her. So we do want to keep in mind, they may not have the same need for variety that they once did. Their food preferences may change. It may be impacted by things like those changes in taste and stuff like that. And so we just need to be flexible and most importantly, be attentive. If your loved one can't communicate or over time loses the ability to communicate, the best way for us to honor their preferences is to use the information that we had that was once accurate. So we go based on what we know, even when they're no longer able to tell us. And that's okay. We definitely want to allow extra time, as we've talked about time and time again in a lot of different contexts. Time is essential for our loved ones with dementia. They just have less energy because they're older and they're slowing down, but they also have less energy because their brain requires so much more energy to do every little thing. And so because of that, it can be very exhausting and it can be very time consuming, and they tend to progress a little more slowly. So it's okay to allow for a lot of time. We have one resident now that will still be eating her breakfast about 10 minutes before we serve lunch. That's just her routine. It takes her that long to be able to chew it and swallow it and be satisfied with it. And often she'll sit and stay right through, stay right through to lunch. And she's okay with it. So we're okay with it.
Why not? It's
okay. Yeah. So, and that's obviously an extreme example. And I don't want to misrepresent, because we also have several residents, the ones that grew up in big families or that had military experience where they'll just speed eat it, and everything in between. But time can definitely be a factor. And so whenever possible, we want to make sure that we're allowing time for them to enjoy the meal at their own pace. And most importantly, eat together. We kind of already touched on this, but eating is a social activity. It's how we connect with people. And so eating together is valuable regardless of who you are and where you are in life. But eating together for a person with dementia is not only that connection, but it's also cueing. You know, if I'm seeing what you're doing, I'm seeing you interact with your plate. I'm seeing you pick up a bite with your fork and put it in your mouth. And hopefully I can generalize that information to be like, oh, wait, I have that fork too. I can do that too. And that can be very powerful for a long time into dementia. So it's both that social element, but also that cognitive support element. If we eat with them, they tend to eat more. People in isolation, we learned through COVID, don't eat as much. And just somehow food is less enjoyable when you enjoy it by yourself, you know? And so absolutely, if your loved one is struggling to eat with them if you can. You know, that's definitely going to go miles. Any thoughts, questions about any of this?
Made me think of my grandmother towards her last few years. I think she got down to about 3 foods, which was pizza, donuts, and ice cream. And we just thought how unnourishing, but she would be so excited, and that's what she asked for.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
I always think, so my granny and pop, and so my granny had dementia, my pop did not, but my granny and pop, when I was younger, never had candy in the house, which, like, when you're a kid is very distressing.
yeah.
And I remember as they got older thinking it was so strange. My grandmother had a candy dish on almost every table, and every single one of them was full of M&Ms. And she would get out of bed in the morning, and the first thing she would do was grab a handful of M&Ms.
Oh,
and it
wow.
was such a departure from who I had always known her to
Yeah.
be. But it was what tasted good, you know. And my grandfather was right there alongside her in the candy bowl, and
Yeah.
they had never been those kind of people. So it really is strange how it changed.
She didn't have dementia, but I thought she just figured by this age, I'm going to eat just my favorites. And that's what it was, got narrowed down to. So, but just brings back memories.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know what?
The truth to it.
Yeah. And you know what? She's right too. At the point that I'm 80, 90 years old, I don't care. I'm not trying to prolong my life anymore. I'm just trying to enjoy what time I've got. Go ahead and eat the cake. You know?
Ooh,
Yeah.
sorry, I'm cutting onions, but let me go away from here. Talking about food and I'm making dinner at the same time. What about, I really do feed my mother more than shrimp, but so when she was here and she had shrimp, she had no idea how to eat it, and she would eat the tails.
Okay.
And I was just kind of like, they're not going to kill her. I guess we let her do it, you know? And because I felt bad, I didn't want to like critique her. She ate dog biscuits too. That one we laughed about. We're like, oh, you want dog biscuits? She was like, these are a little dry. And I'm like, oh my gosh, Mom, they're dog biscuits. They're not cookies, you know? But I don't want to keep telling her, you know, that's wrong. And so I should have limited, you know, what was around, but with the shrimp shells.
Yeah. So I'm actually going to tell you, I think you did a good job, you know?
Okay.
So in a perfect world, because she has not historically eaten the shrimp with the tails still on, if you can remove them before you serve them to her, beautiful, perfect, ideal. Let's, you know, and this is true of any food across the board for any person. The easier we can make it to eat, the more likely they are to eat it, to eat more of it, and to enjoy it more. So that's a good rule of thumb, regardless of the food. So absolutely, you know, moving forward, now that you know that's a struggle, if you can remove the tails, do.
Yeah.
That said, the impact to dignity that happens when we are consistently correcting our loved ones with dementia is far more dangerous than the consequences of eating most things.
Yeah. Right.
Right.
Or at least most edible things, I'm gonna say. So obviously we shouldn't be letting them eat, you know, but really, what is the shell but an extra source of calcium, which is not a bad thing for an elderly person to have. And like, I don't mean to be flippant about it, but there are a lot of cultures in the world where eating the shells is part of eating the shrimp, and that's normal. So she's able to digest it, if she's able to chew it, and if it doesn't seem to be deterring her enjoyment of the meal, that's a win-win as far as I'm concerned. You know, she's satisfied, she's safe, she's capable, no harm done. So congratulations. You weren't sure what to do, but you nailed it. So
Yeah.
Such a learning curve, isn't it?
Yes.
That's why these are so good that you do these sessions for us. I've never had anyone do these before with my dad or relatives and things. This is so very helpful just to talk about it and laugh about it too. Helps us get through how hard it is.
Because I'll tell you, you know, like I've been through it personally since I was a little kid with my great grandmother and my grandmother. I've been through it professionally since I was 16. So, you know, like I've got a lot of experience with dementia, and yet they surprise me daily. You know, like the weird things that they come up with or that they do, or the struggles that you never anticipated. And you're right. Like, one, we need to talk about it, because otherwise we feel a little like we're going crazy. And two, like, how do you know what's normal when nothing is normal? You know, like when every aspect of your loved one is changing, normal is changing every day. And how do you know? And so when you find yourself in a situation like, oh my gosh, she's eating the dog biscuits, what do I do? They're non-toxic, they're made of food, she's fine. You know,
Better than eating the napkin, because I did have a friend whose mom, when she'd sit down, she'd eat the cloth napkin. Like, so, you know, it can get bizarre.
Yeah, and that's exactly my point. You know, so obviously non-food items or like toxic substances, you know, like we had a resident that mistook a bottle of pink nail polish remover for a lovely beverage. And so like, obviously that's a problem. That's a different situation. So when it's a clear safety risk, yes, we're going to intervene. But if it's, you know, if it's food, if it's digestible, and if it doesn't seem to be upsetting them, let it happen. You know, save them the embarrassment, save yourself the anguish over it. It's okay. No harm done. All right. So then we're going to move on to supporting appetite in moderate dementia. And so I've got a little star here on my next two slides because these are technically stage dependent interventions. That does not mean that you can't use them at any point. It's also, like, realistically, it can be very difficult to figure out where your loved one is in the progression of their dementia. And they might be in different stages for different things. So somebody might be in, you know, in severe dementia with regard to some aspects of life and still be pretty mild in others. I've had residents that couldn't tell you what happened 30 seconds ago, but they could tell you every person in this building they'd ever met by name. And like, that's a really strange thing. So take the like stage concept with a very large grain of salt, because it's flexible and it's hard to figure out. And so basically these are just tools that you can use if you see your loved one having particular struggles. Don't get caught up on the timing of it or, you know, the progression of it. So the first thing is that we want to adapt dishes to ability level and keep dignity in mind when we do that. So it's something we don't really think about, but there's actually a lot of ways to successfully eat most foods. So something like cereal or soup, if they're struggling with a bowl and a spoon, put it in a mug or a cup. You know, they can sip it just as effectively, still get it, and not have to worry about that coordination of like, how do I get the spoonful of sloshy stuff to my mouth safely? Particularly for our loved ones who have something like tremors or maybe limited mobility, maybe arthritis, where that's also impacting their ability to kind of maneuver a spoon safely into their mouth, or, you know, consistently into their mouth too. Because if they've got tremors and they're shaking, you know, by the time that spoon gets there, it might be empty. Use a cup. Totally fine. Plates with edges are great. A lot of times, especially in the earlier and more moderate stages of dementia, we'll see that residents will kind of take a scooping motion to get their food. And that can have the result of them pushing all of their food kind of off their plate into their lap. So if you can put an edge on the plate, you know, whether you use a paper plate that naturally has those raised edges, or if you have actual, you know, your actual dishes that have those raised edges, that can certainly help. There are also plate guards that you can purchase online that will fit just about any plate. And it's like a 1-inch thick plastic kind of frame, I guess. It's like a semicircle, and you just clip it onto the plate and you put it on the side closest to your loved one, so that as they're scooping food towards themselves, it hits that wall and pushes the food onto the spoon or the fork. That's an awesome, awesome tool. Cups with straws, cups with lids, cups with handles, depending on your loved one's particular challenges, very, very helpful. And this is a dignity thing. If your loved one, again, has tremors, if they tend to be a little clumsier, maybe they're struggling with their depth perception as part of the changes that they're going through, and so they have a habit of knocking over cups, things like that, by all means, give them a cup with a lid. That does not mean give them a sippy cup. They are not children. You know, let's protect their dignity. And fortunately, with the with the movement of the world towards like people carrying their own reusable mugs and water bottles and things like that, there are a ton of options out there for good, respectable adult non-spill, cup options. So absolutely use those. Things with handles might be easier for some of your loved ones than for others, especially if they have difficulty with arthritis and grip strength. It may be easier for them to use a spoon than a fork. That's something, again, as they tend to use that scooping motion, forks are more intended for stabbing, and so if they're struggling, it's okay. If you need to help them cut up their meat and then they use a fork or use a spoon to eat it, still gets it in their mouth, still an acceptable plan. And then of course there's adaptive equipment for eating as well. So I mentioned the plate rims that you can purchase online. There are all kinds of silverware options that have thicker handles so that it makes it easier for people with those mobility issues, arthritis, things like that, to grip. They tend to be a little pricey, but there are also specialized adaptive equipment eating utensils for people that have range of mobility issues. So if your loved one has, for example, say they have Parkinson's disease and they have a really significant tremor, there are self-leveling spoons and forks where the spoon kind of floats in the handle. So as their hand shakes, the spoon or the fork part stays still, which is amazing. So they can do this and still get the spoon to their mouth in one, in one smooth movement. Awesome. There are also ones for people that have, so sometimes our residents have, like, maybe they have rotator cuff issues, so they can't get their arms up that way. Or some things come with like muscle rigidity and things like that, where they maybe can't relax their arm to be able to get the fork or the spoon to the plate. They also make ones where the heads of the utensils pivot so that they can kind of like just move the handle and the fork or the spoon part does the work. So like I said, they're a little pricey. The one that I'm familiar with is called Liftware, but I'm sure there are alternatives out there if that's something that applies to you and you want to look into it. But there's tons of adaptive eating equipment out there. And by all means, see what's out there. If your loved one is struggling, there's probably a tool to help them. We also want to keep in mind that it is totally acceptable to eat most things with our hands. So, you know, we can use finger foods, so especially when we're thinking about dignity, obvious finger foods, sandwiches, tacos are a little bit challenging with this generation because that wasn't a staple food for them. I'm guessing that that'll probably change, in the future. But yeah, sandwiches, pizza, you mentioned donuts, ice cream cones, things that like make sense to eat with your hands, chicken nuggets, French fries, that sort of thing are all great options. But there's no rule saying you can't pick up some green beans with your fingers and eat them either. Totally fine. If that's what your loved one needs to do to eat, we encourage that and support it. And we want to keep in mind that neatness is not a priority. So if our loved one is already struggling, sometimes, especially when those mobility issues are part of it, odds are good they're going to make a mess. If they're having trouble getting their silverware to their mouth, with the food in one piece, odds are good they're going to make a little bit of a mess. We definitely don't want to shame them. We definitely don't want to create a situation that's going to be embarrassing for them. So we're not going to draw attention to it. I think that this is a hard thing for some families, especially if they like to take their loved one out to restaurants and things like that. It can be a little bit embarrassing. Ultimately, we have to think about what our real priority is. And if looking presentable to strangers at the restaurant that you're never going to see again is more important than your loved one's appetite and comfort, don't take them to restaurants.
Right.
If you're going to take your loved one to a restaurant, accept that that's the reality of the situation, and you do what you can to make that experience as enjoyable as possible for them. And if the mess is a problem, there are other things we can do to adapt. So clothing protectors are a great place to start. We don't call them bibs for seniors because bibs are for babies. And so clothing protectors are certainly something that you can use. There are some really wonderful ones that look like clothing, which is awesome. If you get the kind that, look like a towel or a big napkin, totally fine, gets the job done. But there are some really lovely ones out there, or if you're crafty and you have a sewing machine, you can also make them from old clothing. But I've seen great ones that are made from actual men's and women's shirts, where they basically cut the back off. And so the collar remains intact. Maybe the sleeves remain intact to help keep it in place. And it's just a shirt front. So you can put it on them before they get to the table, get to the restaurant, whatever it is. And to the untrained eye or to the passerby, they're just wearing a normal shirt. But then once they've made a mess of it, you can really quickly take it off, and they've still got a nice clean shirt on, and they're still protected, from a dignity perspective, from an embarrassment perspective. So those are phenomenal. Placemats or tablecloths are a great option. A lot of restaurants have them already. So if that's something that's a priority to you, you can use them, but they're also really powerful at home. I recommend non-skid ones. So as your loved one is pulling their food towards them, pulling their dishes towards them, that's going to help keep it from falling off the table into their lap. So if you've ever had that, like almost foam rubber kind of shelf paper thing, like those type of placemats, they can be great. There's lots of different options. And then of course, adaptive equipment that we already talked about. Then we want to limit the options and use visual cues whenever possible. And that's true both when we choose the food and when we're having them eat them. So again, that choice anxiety and then decision making is a known impact of dementia. We know that dementia limits our loved one's ability to make good decisions, or to make decisions at all in some cases. So giving them too many choices can be very overwhelming. Whenever possible, we want to limit it to 2, maybe 3 options, depending on how our loved one handles choice. And if we can, we want them to see those options. So again, pictures, or I know Here we have the luxury of being able to show them both plates. Here, would you like the fruit salad and yogurt platter, or would you prefer the chicken sandwich platter? And they can say, oh, that one looks good, and point, which is great. But we also want to keep that same thing in mind when the plate is in front of them. So as I mentioned, that choice anxiety in the beginning, if there are 3-4 things on a plate and I don't know what to start with, I'm just not going to eat. And so if we can maybe bring things one or two things on the plate at a time, where the plate itself is less visually overwhelming, it can be really helpful. And so that might look like, and that kind of feels fancy. That might look like turning a dinner into a 4-course meal, because we're going to have our soup, and then we're going to have our meat, and then we're going to have our vegetable, and then we're going to have our potato, kind of a thing. And that way they've only got one thing to focus on. Or maybe you do, like the meat and the potato, and then the vegetable is separate, kind of a thing. Whatever makes sense to you, whatever works for your loved one, but reducing that visual overstimulation so that it's easier for them to choose what thing they want to start with. And then the last one, this is my favorite, is that we want to consider and adapt to memory challenges. So I daily hear both of these things.
Haven't eaten for 4 days.
Yes, literally every day. I think the record is that I once had a resident tell me that she hadn't eaten in 36 days. That's the highest number I've ever heard. But I've had residents do both, and this, hand to God, happens at least once a day. So I'll get the residents that are like, it's lunchtime already? I just ate. And then I'll also get the residents who are like, I'm starving to death. I haven't eaten in days. And we know that they just cleared their entire plate 20 minutes ago.
Right.
It's okay.
Something from a memory. I'm thinking 36 days reminds me of a story my students read, that this kid was lost in the woods for 36 days and he had to eat from the woods. But you just wonder if things like that stick in their memory from their past, when they, how certain things stick.
Yeah,
to
absolutely.
pick a number like that is so
right, because it's so specific, right?
Yeah.
So I would guess, yes, there's some logic to this. Dementia, we routinely say, dementia does not mean stupid. There's logic in everything they do.
Yeah.
It's just not necessarily what we would consider logical.
Right.
The brain operates an entirely different way. So it's kind of like comparing apples to oranges, if you expect I can't even think, like if you expect a toddler to drive a car the same way that you expect a NASCAR driver, clearly your expectations are a little goofy, kind of a thing. And so it's a really similar situation. There's something in there that's contributing to, we just don't necessarily know what it is, but we don't have to be able to react to it. And so when we think about, but I just ate, okay, now's not the time to feed them. If realistically, like sometimes we know, okay, they didn't eat much for breakfast, which means they haven't eaten since dinner last night. We really need to get some food in them before they start to, kind of feel the effects, get sleepy, get lethargic, that sort of thing. You can offer an alternative. Oh, you just ate supper? How about some dessert? Can I get you dessert? At least then we're still getting something in them. Totally fine. It's also totally fine to reapproach, that's what microwaves are for. In 10 minutes and 15 minutes, we can come back and try again, or we can put it in the refrigerator and heat it up 2 hours later when they're hungry. Hunger will come back. And so it's okay if we, just kind of follow their cue on that. With regard to I haven't eaten in days. So obviously that's a time when they're saying, I'm starving. We're going to feed them. Okay. I don't care if they finished their plate and walked away from it 2 minutes ago. even if they ate an entire plate, even if they ate seconds, I'm still going to feed them because they're still telling me they're hungry. And so we go with that. And it tends to balance out. So often the person who told you like, oh, I'm stuffed, I've just finished my meal, I can't eat, will also be the person who tells you they haven't eaten in days later. So it kind of evens out. But if your loved one is consistently doing this, like they consistently can't remember the last time they eat and they feel like they're starving, if you're concerned about their diet, so maybe weight, we tend to think in terms of weight loss is the enemy, but if weight gain is the enemy for your loved one for whatever reason, maybe they have health issues, diabetes, high blood pressure, things like that, where you have to be mindful of their diet. Break their meals down into smaller pieces so that when they come back, you can give them more, So if your loved one is like, oh my gosh, I'm so hungry, I need my breakfast, give them some toast. And then 15 minutes later, when they come back and they're like, oh my gosh, I'm starving, I haven't eaten breakfast, give them some cereal. And then when they come back, then you give them some fruit, and then you give them some eggs, and then however many times it takes, it's okay to break up the meal like that if you know this is a struggle that your loved one has. Thoughts, questions about any of these?
When, if they're not hungry,
Mhm.
do you guys there encourage them to just sit and have a cup of tea with their friends at their table, like that they don't have to eat a full meal?
It depends on the person. So
Okay.
for a lot of them, mealtime is very social for them. So we always give them the option, your friends are waiting for you at the table. You're welcome to join, you're welcome to join us, even if you're not hungry. And I'll say often, if we can get them to the table, once they're sitting with other people and once they're seeing other people eat, they usually do want to eat.
Yeah. Okay, good.
But if they don't, we don't force it. If we bring in the plate and they're like, no, I'm just going to socialize. Okay, no problem. If you change your mind, let me know. Take it back. And so they don't necessarily remember that we've said that. So, so we might come back in a few minutes and say like, oh, would you like anything? Can I get you anything? And we just reapproach, and there's no harm in that. We also tend to know whose appetites do what for the most part. So I know that if I give this person a plate heaping with food, they're going to take one look at it and walk away because they have a small appetite and that plate is overwhelming and they're never going to touch it. So for that person who's told me they're not hungry, I'm going to give them a smaller portion so that they're more inclined to feel like they can handle it versus giving them just like a mountain of food, hoping they eat something.
That's the other problem with restaurants.
Mm-hmm.
They think I'll never eat all of that. I can't eat all that. And they can't even get started. And, you say you want to divide it in half and take it home. Well, I don't have a refrigerator. And well, then I'll take it home. Just, trying to convince them to give them half.
Yeah. And this is the Depression era generation. So food waste tends to be something that a lot of them are very fixated on. So, and it's kind of funny because it's counterintuitive. Like you would think, okay, if I order you this meal, or if I put this meal in front of you, eating half of it is less wasteful than eating none of it. But again, that logic is different. And so when they're seeing it, they're thinking, I'm never going to eat this. Please give it to somebody else. Somebody who's going to eat it. So, especially in that situation or in a restaurant, you might preface, like when the waiter or waitress comes to take your order, you might say, hey, can you box half of it up before you bring it to the table?
Yeah. That's a Weight Watchers trick from decades ago.
Yeah, absolutely. And it works here too.
It works. Yeah.
Yeah. So you could do that. You might ask them to bring an extra plate, and that way you can physically remove whatever's extra. Or if they're having that choice anxiety problem, you can put one thing on each plate and then kind of give them one at a time. That's certainly an option.
Yeah.
Ordering kids menu portions, totally fine. The food is the same. You can tell them to, skip the coloring book menu and the crayons, again, for that dignity perspective, unless your loved one likes to color, in which case go for it. Who cares? So it's very much a what works for your person kind of a situation. But if they were going to eat a cheeseburger and they're not going to eat that whole cheeseburger, guaranteed there's a cheeseburger on the kids menu, get the smaller one.
Yeah.
That's okay. So there's almost always a way to adapt. So,
Yeah.
So we do that. Any other thoughts? Any other questions? No? Okay. So then, we're moving on to later in dementia. And again, if it works for your loved one, it works regardless of where they are. But just as a general rule, this is more for late dementia. So again, we're going to be using those visual cues I talked about. So we're sitting eating with them so that they can see us eating. We're showing them what their food choices are whenever possible so that they know what they're getting. That sort of thing, definitely. We can use hand over hand support. So often in the later stages of dementia, we might not have the cognitive memory of what eating is supposed to look like, but the muscle memory is still there. You think about how often you eat in your lifetime over the course of, 80, 90 years, somewhere in there, your body knows what to do, even if your mind doesn't. And so if our loved one needs hand over hand support, we might start the meal by putting the fork in their hand and then holding their hand and using it to, pick up something with the fork or with the spoon and then getting it to their mouth. And so if we're doing that, like, it's kind of going to look funny because you're holding their hand and guiding it through the motions. But after we do that for a couple of minutes, then sometimes that muscle memory kicks in and they can do it on their own from there. Totally an acceptable option. We can also feed our loved one as necessary. And so when we're planning to feed our loved one, if they've gotten to such a state that they're not able to feed themselves, we want to do it again in a way that's mindful of their dignity. So this is not like feeding a child at a high chair where you're going to stand over them and put a spoon in their mouth every few minutes, that sort of thing. Sit at the table next to them. Feed them, from an even playing field. Try not to draw attention to it, especially if you're in a public place like a restaurant. We don't want to embarrass them in a setting like that. So if you do need to feed them, if your loved one needs that type of support, by all means, sit with them, be present with them, be close to them, and feed them that way, rather than like the extended reach across the table or standing over them or kind of walking away and then coming back, which isn't helping from that social perspective either. And we do want to keep in mind that when we're making the decision to feed our loved one, it needs to be about their need and their benefit and not our convenience. And I know that that is a hard pill to swallow. So this kind of goes hand in hand, like I said at the beginning, with allowing for extra time. If your loved one is struggling to feed themselves, but they are capable of feeding themselves, you rob them of an opportunity to be independent if you do it for them. And I get that we're busy people and we have places to be, but that's putting our need ahead of theirs, if that makes sense. And there may be times when that's necessary. I understand that there's no blanket statement that's right for everyone, but the majority of the time we should be doing it because our loved one needs it, not because it makes our lives easier. What we do for them, we take from them, is kind of how we need to look at it. And if we want them to be as able as possible for as long as possible, everything we do for them robs them of that opportunity. So it's kind of it's a hard pill to swallow sometimes, but it's an important one. And then we want to meet dietary needs and restrictions with real foods whenever possible. So especially in the later stages of dementia, we tend to see swallowing difficulties. We tend to see maybe inability to chew. We may see weight loss because of those things, all of that stuff. Yes, there are tons of food supplements. Yes, food processors are a wonderful thing, and we can make sure they still eat the foods they always love. But I'm going to be very honest with you. Would you want to eat a piece of pureed chicken? I wouldn't. I don't want my chicken to be the texture of mashed potatoes. That's gross. So, and so if we feel that way, odds are very good that our loved ones feel that way as well. Were you going to say something?
Oh, me now. No, I do remember seeing platters in my dad's unit. It was all pureed, like a pile of green, pile of white, another pile of white because it was probably chicken in it. It was just, oh, I
Yeah,
don't know how they eat it, but
and it's awful. And really, we eat with our eyes before we ever eat with our mouths, and so if the
True,
plate doesn't look good, you're not going to want to eat it. But then again, when we've lost sensory ability and we can no longer taste the food, the texture becomes infinitely more important. And so a plate of a lot of unappetizing mush is unappetizing, So whenever possible, and I realize, again, no blanket statements, so it's not always possible, but whenever possible, we want to use real foods that support our loved one's need. So if we're thinking about adding a health shake, we might first think about giving them a milkshake. If weight loss is the concern, double the desserts. That's a win-win. They're happy.
meringue pie.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, double the desserts, add calories where you can, throw some extra butter and some cream cheese and some sour cream in those mashed potatoes. They'll be fattening, but they'll do the trick, like that sort of thing. There's, there's lots of ways that we can add. And so when we're thinking about things like purees, we might want to lean more towards naturally soft foods instead. So like if we're thinking about meat, chicken is softer than steak, fish is softer than chicken. That's kind of, so we want to use softer proteins. Or we might use non-meat proteins like beans and things like that we can, make an appropriate texture. We're going to focus on foods that are already the right consistency. So mashed potatoes, ice cream, pudding, soups, chilies, things like that already have the texture we're going for, that lets our loved one have what they need medically, but also still enjoy their meal and still be able to enjoy their meal. So that's a great thing. When we think about liquids, so this is not, I don't know if this is something that you're familiar with, but sometimes as we get older and we start to have those swallowing difficulties, thin liquids become a problem. It's just very hard for us to swallow them without having them go down the wrong pipe. You might lean towards thicker juices, rather than a lemonade or a cranberry juice. Maybe you're going to go with like a juice that's got some pulp to it or something like that. Or if you've had like those Green Machine shakes and things like that, where they're bottled juices, but they're a little bit thicker consistency, great, use those. Guava juice, I think, tends to have a thicker consistency. You can kind of play that by ear. Milk, stuff like that, where they're still getting a fluid, but without using thickener. Thickener is certainly an option. It is there. It is a tool for you to use if your loved one needs it. But I don't know if you've ever tried thickened water, but it is an experience for sure. So if you think about a nice, refreshing glass of ice water, you definitely have a picture in your head. And when that picture pours like maple syrup, it's different. So just something to be aware of. If we can use natural substitutes, do use natural substitutes, but know that those tools are there if you need them. And then we can always add, when weight loss is the concern, you can always add something to give more calories. So sprinkle sugar, sprinkle syrup, add extra butter, extra cream, extra cheese, things like that make the food more flavorful, but that also make it more calorie dense. It's also worth noting that the food you add does not have to make sense. Okay, so if our loved ones are retaining sweet and are retaining salty as the sensations that they can best taste, what I see every day is that most of our residents who struggle with eating will always eat dessert. And so if we can make their meal more like dessert, we improve the odds that we're going to see them eat it. And so that might mean sprinkling a sugar packet on a slice of pizza. That might mean pouring a pack of syrup on a Salisbury steak. And that sounds vile. But at this point, when that's the only thing they can taste, they're not tasting Salisbury steak and maple syrup. They're just tasting maple syrup. But they're getting the nutrition from the food underneath of it. And so it's okay. A very dear friend of mine, her grandmother had this issue, and what worked for her was that they put grape jelly on everything. And so every day at lunchtime, she would have a ham and cheese sandwich with grape jelly.
Yeah.
Because she would eat it. And it got her more food, it got her more nutrition. And we've had residents where we'll sprinkle a sugar packet across the top of their food because it makes them eat it. We've had residents where we pour maple syrup on every meal, or we serve maple syrup with every meal. And 9 times out of 10, they'll do it. We have one resident that she gets a cup of cranberry juice at every meal, and she pours it onto her plate at every meal. But she cleans her plate. And so we want to refrain from judgment, because what works for them is what works. It's not about what's right or what makes sense or what's real. It's about what gets them to eat. And if that's what they need to be able to taste their food and enjoy it, absolutely fine. And of course, if we need the supplements, if we need the thickeners, they're there. And then we also want to try for smaller, more frequent meals. So as our loved one has progressively more difficulty eating, again, they're not getting a lot of physical activity at these later stages. They're not building up a lot of appetite, and their digestion is slowed. So they're staying fuller longer. Rather than giving them 2 or 3 big meals a day, maybe we're going to come with smaller meals more often. So it's more like a series of snacks, but with real foods whenever possible, so that we can kind of meet them in the middle on that. And that way they're getting the nutrition they need, but not in such a way that they're exhausting themselves trying to eat it when eating is very tiresome. And they're not feeling weighed down by that like brick of food in their stomach all day too. Again, this is a total person experience. We want them to have a good quality of life. We want them to be comfortable, and suffering through eating and then suffering because you ate is suffering, so if we can do more frequent, smaller meals so that they're not feeling hungry, but they are getting what they need and they're not feeling uncomfortably full, it's beautiful. That's the best case scenario. Okay. Thoughts or questions about this? No? Okay. So then I want to talk about some safety concerns. So I sort of touched on this with the late stage dementia in terms of swallowing difficulties and things like that. Realistically, there are some safety concerns associated with eating. So if you notice that your loved one is having a problem with eating, a great first course of action is to have them see a speech language pathologist for testing and treatment. That seems a little strange. I think we tend to think of speech therapists as being like a child thing, but they actually do a lot of phenomenal work. And so much of speech is like how the mouth and the throat move and how they work. And so when we think about it in that perspective, it pretty naturally relates to eating, so they can help identify specific types of swallowing issues and then use that to help give you better strategies. So it's kind of, we don't necessarily think about what goes into swallowing, but if our loved one is struggling with it, it may be that they can't chew the food. It may be that their tongue can't get the food successfully to the back of their throat. It may be that their throat isn't correctly addressing the food that's placed in front of it. It may be that their esophagus is not moving the food down. And if you don't know which of those it is, it's hard to deal with it. And so if we can take them to the professional and have the testing done, they can help us modify our approach to address whatever our loved one's specific challenge is so that they can eat more effectively for a longer period of time. We definitely want to be mindful of food textures that might be difficult to chew or swallow. So again, like crunchy carrots, apples, tough meat, things like that. We already know, like if you've ever had a tough steak or a tough pork chop and you've really worked at it for a few minutes and you feel like you're never going to successfully swallow that bite, that's kind of what your loved one is going through with a lot of things. So we want to make sure that we're mindful of the textures that we're serving. We want to be mindful of their body positioning. And so again, especially in those later stages where eating becomes difficult, often at those times, our loved ones are also largely, if not totally, bedbound. Eating in bed is not a great situation from a safety perspective. And so whenever possible, we want to make sure that their body positioning is correct to support eating. And this is true at a table too. You know, if your loved one is slouched back or is hunched forward, it's going to affect the way that the food flows through their body. So if our head is tilted back, if we're leaning back, we're far more likely to choke because the food is falling back before we're ready for it. If we're leaning forward, if we're hunched over, if we're kind of crunched in the middle, you know, like you might be if you're laying in bed, but you're propped up on a lot of pillows, it may be that food is having trouble getting past that bend because our esophageal muscles have weakened. And then you're only going to get in as much as your throat can kind of hold, or it's coming back. You know, so body positioning is important, and we want to make sure that we're paying attention to that to help prevent choking, vomiting, heartburn, acid reflux, all of those sorts of things that that might make eating less enjoyable and more painful for our loved one. We want to attend to how much food is in the mouth and make sure that the mouth is clear, you know, before we add more. So we know having too much in your mouth at once is not a good idea from a safety perspective. Sometimes, especially for our loved ones that do have teeth missing, have sensitive teeth, damaged teeth, whatever the case may be, it takes them longer to chew. And sometimes that's something that we're not cognizantly thinking about, and we might be encouraging them to take more before they've cleared their mouth. So we want to make sure that we're paying attention to how much food is in their mouth, how effectively they're chewing it, and how to clear it. And maybe, depending on your loved one, maybe that means when they've gotten it into real tiny pieces, we encourage them to take a drink to wash all that down. For other people, that might be the wrong approach, and we just need to be patient. And so unfortunately, that's kind of a trial and error process. So you do have to figure it out, but it is something that you want to be paying attention to in those later stages as your loved one is struggling. And then we want to think about the sounds that they make when they're not eating. You know, obviously the sounds while they're eating as well, but sounds that they make throughout the day. If your loved one has a wet cough, if they frequently have difficulty breathing, if they frequently get respiratory infections, those are good signs that they're not swallowing properly. You know, so there are other things, obviously, you know, you get a flu and you get mucusy, that sort of thing, that certainly can cause a wet cough. But if your loved one has not been sick, but has a wet cough, that might be because they've gotten fluid into their lungs. It might be because they've got food in their lungs and their body is producing mucus to try to get that, you know, to try to protect them from that foreign body or from that foreign liquid. So if they have a wet cough, that could signify that they're having difficulty swallowing and that their food is getting in their lungs and they're aspirating. That'll also cause difficulty breathing. If you see a lot of pneumonia, RSV, things like that, they seem to get sick and get sick and get sick. Definitely check in with that speech language pathologist, because there's a good chance that's what's causing that is that they're aspirating their food. Their food is going into their lungs rather than into their stomach. So we want to make sure that we're paying attention to that so that we can protect our loved one. And then my last point on this, and this is maybe not necessarily a safety concern, but it is a family concern. So I wanted to make sure that I address it. I've seen a lot of our residents go through end stage dementia. I've seen a lot of our residents be at this point where they can't speak, can't communicate, can't chew and swallow, are largely bedbound. And it's very hard for families to watch. It's very hard for us to watch, to see people that we care about go through that. And so when we think about from a food perspective, a question that a lot of families ask me is, are they suffering? Like they're not able to eat. Are they starving? They're not able to drink. Are they thirsty? Are they uncomfortable? And what do we do about this? So it's not necessarily a safety concern, but I do want to talk about it, even though it's a little bit hard. So I will say right out of the gate, the current literature, the current research suggests that the answer is no. Okay. The current research about dementia and appetite in the late stages suggests that because our body functions have changed so significantly, because our metabolisms and our lifestyles have slowed down so much, we're not building up an appetite and we're not building up thirst in the same way. So where you and I might feel hungry if we've gone, 5-6 hours without a meal, they're not necessarily having that same nutritional demand. So their body isn't sending the same signals for hunger and thirst that we would expect. Research also suggests that the parts of the brain that interpret those cues kind of diminish by this stage in the game. So it's a little bit of column A, a little bit of column B. I have less need for food and water, but I also am less able to feel my need for food and water. And if you can't feel hungry, then you don't feel hungry, so that's the upside of that. I do have a little asterisk here because research changes all the time. And so realistically, as recently as the 70s and 80s, which is very recent, in terms of research and medical care tends to be concerned, as recently as the 70s and 80s, research suggested that people with dementia did not feel pain. And we know that's not true. But the research at the time said that that's the reason people with dementia will walk on broken hips and broken legs. That's the reason that they'll make the unsafe decisions they make, is because they don't have the ability to process pain. And research backed that at one time. And even to this day, like right now in 2023, people with dementia get less pain treatment because this is still a pervasive idea. So, like I said, research suggests that they're not suffering, but that our understanding may change as things go on. So for now, we take comfort in what we can. And so the flip side of that is, if you're worried that your loved one is suffering, there are comfort measures that we can take at that point in their lives. That's what hospice care is for. That's what palliative care is for. There are tons of comfort medications and other interventions that we can use to help minimize any suffering that may or may not be occurring at this stage. So, fortunately, none of you with me are in that position, but if it comes to that, if you ever find yourself there, know that even if your loved one cannot eat or drink, that does not necessarily mean that they're uncomfortable, and that we can do something to keep them comfortable. Okay. Thoughts, questions about any of that?
No, this was great.
Okay. All right. So we've got
Have to
one more.
vote.
What's that?
I'm gonna have to vote. It was good seeing you.
Okay. Well, thank you for joining us, Linda. Have
Thank
a good night.
you.
I do have one more slide for us to go through, but you can catch it
Okay.
later. I
Yeah,
appreciate you.
I'll
joining
watch the
us.
recording. Thanks.
Okay. And so the very last thing that I want to talk about is moving the goalposts on why we think about eating. So we need to acknowledge that meals are not just for nutrition. They are through most of our lives. Meals are nutrition, they are sustenance, they are preventative care in a lot of cases. If you eat well and maintain a healthy lifestyle, food is very powerful in predicting how our health and how our lives are going to unfold. At the point that we are elderly, that our loved one is older, they're in their 80s, they're in their 90s, they're at this point, we're no longer trying to prevent health concerns. They've already got them. And we're no longer trying to focus on strictly nutrition. It's about quality of life. So when we think about what food is for at this stage of the game, particularly for our loved ones with dementia, food is about engagement. How do we include them in this process? So if they liked to cook, let them help you in the kitchen. Give them what they're capable of doing. If they're no longer capable of helping, have them sit there and watch and talk with them about what you're doing as you're going through it. That's an opportunity to include them, even if they can't physically participate. Food is about socialization. We've talked, I've belabored this point, but it really is powerful for connection. This is a way for our loved ones to feel included, to feel connected at a time when they may be struggling to connect with other people because of the communication barriers and the limits that their dementia poses to them. It's about independence. So we talked a lot about adaptive equipment, about changing the meal experience to allow them to do those things. A lot of our loved ones with dementia struggle with control. They struggle with feeling helpless. And so if we can give them opportunities to be successful, mealtime happens 3-4 times a day. That's a lot of opportunities to help them feel, empowered, which is a beautiful thing. This is a multi-sensory experience. So like I said, we eat with our eyes before we eat with our mouths. We eat with our noses. We eat with our hands sometimes. And so if the food looks good, if it's colorful, if it's arranged nicely, all of that is going to help. If the environment that we're eating in is pleasant, if our motor skills are able to address what we're eating, that's all great. And I can tell you, we have a resident right now that anything casserole is very upsetting for her. So things like lasagna, chicken pot pie, stuff like that we might think of as staples, and often those are considered like great comfort foods. The second that food goes on the plate in front of her, she sees it as a pile of mush, and she every time without fail will say, "What is this slop?" So we want to make sure that the food looks appetizing, and what looks appetizing may be different for different people. Now, my granny was a good old Southern lady, so if you throw a chicken pot pie down in front of her, she was going to eat it all day long. So it really depends on the person, but we do want to think about what it looks like, what that experience is like for them beyond just the flavor and the eating itself, but also the total package. We want to think about traditions and culture. Classic favorite foods, 99% of the time are going to win. If they loved it before, odds are good they're going to love it now. But this is also a time to experiment with new flavors. So if your loved one is losing their sense of taste and they're having difficulty enjoying food because they can't taste, this might be a great time to experiment with some new spices, some new seasonings that are going to kind of trip their brain up a little bit and make it take notice. So like, oh, what is that? So maybe this is a time when you throw in something like curry or cumin or something that's a little more potent that maybe they wouldn't have liked, because maybe now it works, and that's okay too. And most importantly, food is about comfort and love. Think about what meal times mean to you. Think about the history of meals in your lifetime. If your mom prepared prepared meals for you with love, and you sat and enjoyed them as a family, like those tend to be really powerful memories. That doesn't change. Even when our loved ones don't know who we are, that doesn't change. So if we're taking the time to break bread with them, if we're sitting with them, if we're enjoying a meal with them, that company is incredibly powerful. And so food becomes a symbol of comfort and love. And that has value regardless of where you are in the stage of dementia, regardless of who you are as a person. So we want to change the focus, not from nutrition alone, to incorporating all those things. We want to think about palliative care versus preventative care. So again, we're no longer preventing health issues. We're not stopping the high blood pressure. They've either got it at this stage or they don't. And if they don't, odds are good they're not getting it now. Same with diabetes. odds are good if they were going to get it, they would have had it already by now. So we want to make sure that comfort and happiness come first. We want to make sure that they're getting the calorie content they need to maintain their weight. That's more important than what the nutrition is. So I know, like, your doctor will tell you, avoid salt, avoid sugar, they're the enemies. But at this stage in their lives, all they can taste is salt and sugar. Are we going to rob them of that enjoyment for what's really, like, in your 80s and 90s? Maybe that modification in your diet changes your lifespan like this much, but you're miserable for that much more of your life.
Right.
Is that worth it? And I know, so my family was fortunate to be able to be with my grandmother throughout the progression of her dementia. She did have diabetes, and my parents to this day, so she passed a few years ago, but my parents to this day will say that they wish they had spent less time arguing with her over sweets, that they wish they had just let her have it, because, it didn't have the impact. And the research confirms this. So if you were to look, and I encourage you always to do your own research, but if you look at the research, it confirms that the benefits of being able to eat what you want and what's appetizing to you outweigh the risks of the health deficits of the food at this stage of life.
Mhm.
So, and we want to make sure that we're considering actual and perceived concerns too. So I know a thing that I see a lot is like, but what if they become diabetic? They're not. We don't operate from a hypothetical scenario. We operate from the reality in front of us. You've all heard me say a million times by this point, we use the reality we're given, and this is the reality we're given. So if they're not diabetic, we're not going to regulate their sugar in case they become diabetic. We're going to operate based on who they are right now, and they're fine, and we want to make sure that we're avoiding moral judgments. Foods are not good or bad. So a thing that I see a lot is, I know you only want to eat the cake, or I know you only want to eat the ice cream, but you have to eat your dinner first. That's a lesson that we instill in children. It's not a lesson that we need to be instilling in our elderly parents and our elderly loved ones. They already know that lesson. This is about what they can eat. So eating is the goal. Food is not good or bad. It's a tool to get them there. Calorie count matters. So I have a resident that every meal we offer him food, and 9 times out of 10, he ends up eating a bowl of ice cream and a cup of orange juice. That's okay. He's eating, and he's lived a good long life eating like that, and his life continues. And so it's okay. So there's no morality related to food. There really should never be. I think we do ourselves a great disservice by feeling guilty about eating the things that we enjoy, but particularly at this stage, it's not about what's good and what's bad. It's about what you can get in them, and how that makes them feel. Thoughts, questions about any of this?
My mother's cardiologist, who she only went to maybe a couple of years because she had one slightly irregular EKG, and he finally just let her go because everything was fine, but she was taking a cholesterol medicine at the time, and I don't believe she's taking one anymore, but I think he took her off of it because her numbers were really not that elevated. And I was surprised when he said, just let her have her ice cream and pie and her macaroni or whatever, because he was probably at that same research, like at this age, it's, let them be happy for that little bit, so anyway, I was surprised to hear, cardiologists say that, just let her have her ice cream. And so, and a question I have is, do they ever have pizza for any of your meals at all?
Yeah, we do pizza for
Do you?
dinner, I would say at least once every 2 weeks.
Oh, okay.
It's actually it's a pretty solid staple around here because it's a great finger food and it's universally like recognizable and accepted by a lot of our residents. So yeah, we serve pizza quite a bit actually.
Okay, good.
Yeah. So, Linda, did you have anything? I saw you on mute.
Hi, Courtney. This was great, very informative. A lot of it makes sense.
Good.
I have one quick question.
Sure.
John loves to bring food in for mom, especially when he knows he's made something that she thoroughly enjoys.
Okay.
And he likes to take it in for her, and the staff always is very agreeable to warming it up for her, and she has it for dinner.
Mhm.
Does something like that cause a problem with the other residents? I mean, are they going to be jealous or upset or envious or anything? We don't want to cause problems.
No, absolutely not. We do have occasions where a resident will look at someone else's plate and say, I'd like that. But I can tell you it's never been a problem. And even if it were, there are a lot of ways that we can solve that are not depriving your mom of the food that she loves and that you would love to share with her and that John would love to share with her. I am never, ever, under any circumstances, going to take something that makes someone's life happy away because it makes somebody else unhappy. So, it's just not gonna happen. So absolutely, if you and John have prepared something that she loves and that you think she's going to enjoy, bring it in. She can eat it in the room. She can eat it at her table with her friends. If she wants to share and there's enough to share, great. If there's not, that's fine too. You know, we'll make sure that they're satisfied with their choices. We can explain the situation to them. Fortunately, she sits with people that are pretty understanding in that respect. But even as things progress and that situation may change, there's a lot that we can do to help balance that. I'm not going to rob her of something that she enjoys and that you want to share with her. So yeah, by all means, tell John he can bring in whatever he likes as often as he likes, and we're very happy to continue to serve it to her.
That's great to hear. Thank you very much. We appreciate it.
Absolutely. All right, so that's it for tonight. Anybody have any ideas for a future session, something that you've been thinking about? It's been like kind of nagging at the back of your brain that we could talk about.
I don't know if you've ever done the topic and because I haven't watched, come into the Zoom meeting, a lot of them, but I saved them all in a folder on my email, and I have been looking at them little by little. But sometimes I feel guilty, like I need to get my mother out.
Okay.
More. And I had mentioned it, I think, to you a long time ago. Like, I feel like she gets very discombobulated when I take her out, and I worry that it takes her a while to readjust to where she is when she comes back. So that's, and it's more so when I take her for a ride.
Okay.
And I don't take her to my kids' houses. Well, the one in Collingswood I have, but I have one in Pennsylvania. It's 45 minutes, and that is a problem because it's every minute. Why so far? Where are we going? That kind of thing. And one in Morristown. So I don't know if you've done one on that about getting the residents out, and what should you do, not do? How does it affect them?
Okay. Yeah, I think that's a great topic. So I'll definitely add that to my list. So my quick answer for now is that you follow her lead. So I know when you've taken her out, I know you're seeing that she's taking a little time to bounce back, and that may be true in like the immediate minutes and hours following returning while you're still here with her. But we're not seeing long-term consequences of that.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay?
Of course, it hasn't been much lately other than a dentist appointment, but yeah, so And if it's something I think I've heard you say you encourage that we get them out. So
Yeah.
I'm just wondering how great of effect is that on them, and maybe how important is it that we try to? So
Yeah.
I've had thoughts about that and not really knowing. But
Yeah, absolutely. I would love to dive into that in more detail. So I will definitely put that on the list. I think there's a lot of value for them in getting out. They, they're masters of mindfulness. They're always kind of stuck in the moment they're living right now. And so
right.
if getting out, even for that short time, is making them happy, it's something they want to do in that short time. To
Mhm.
me, that's valuable regardless of the consequences after the fact. What I see a lot of people go through, and we'll talk about this in more detail, but what I see a lot of people go through is that maybe once upon a time mom could handle an all day outing or a really long car ride, but now she can't, she needs to go to the bathroom before we get there, and it's just impossible to navigate in a rest stop or a gas station, or
Right.
or she seems worn out after an hour or two, and then I have to leave abruptly to bring her home.
Right.
So those are things that we kind of learn a little at a time, and we adjust a little at a time. So as the car ride becomes a barrier, we go shorter distances, we go to closer locations. As the time limit becomes a barrier, we shorten the length of
Yeah.
the visits, and that's
Mhm.
okay.
Sometimes it's just out back or out front when the weather,
Yeah, absolutely. And sometimes it's about the socialization aspect, like a restaurant might be too overwhelming, but an ice cream stand might be okay. And so
perfect.
so
A hot dog and an ice cream. I
yeah,
have a spot that I take her.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah,
but
so there's-
and then there's
there's a
times
lot.
I come and it's like, I'm not moving out of bed. Please no. And then other times she's, so it's
Yeah,
you gotta read her.
absolutely.
So,
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll definitely put that on the list. We
Yeah.
will definitely talk about that. I had kind of tentatively planned for next time, but I can absolutely switch gears. I think this is also based on a conversation you and I had actually. But
when to help them or
when to help, yeah. So I believe that
Hopefully.
was you, and it was like,
yeah.
how do we know when our loved one needs more help, and when are we overstepping our boundaries? And so I kind of
Right.
said tonight, what we do for them, we take from them. So this is obviously a really pressing concern. So I was kind of thinking of that for next month. I'm okay with switching gears if this is the bigger priority. If it doesn't matter,
No,
I'll go one,
they're
and I'll
all
do
good
the other.
topics. It doesn't matter. And I mean, we still have a couple of months before it really gets warm enough for them to go outside. You know what I
Yeah.
mean?
That's a fair
So,
point too. So I'll
Yeah.
stick with the current game plan. So next month we'll do
Yeah.
to help or not to help, and and then maybe we'll follow that up with to go or not to go,
Right.
how do
Like to
we
go
do
into the bathroom with her or not, since you said to go or not to go.
Yeah.
But to go in the bathroom and help or just hang back,
Okay.
'Cause I know the aides go right in and, get a pull up and just do their thing. But I guess because of being a daughter or something, I still want to give her privacy. So,
Yeah,
so
and often
part of that,
and often they react very differently to us versus to family.
yeah.
Sometimes for better, sometimes for worse. So yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So I'll stick with that for next month.
Yeah,
We'll talk
that's
on
good.
that. And then I'll add, figuring out the outing situation after that. I think that's a great suggestion. All right.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you. Another good one.
Thank you.
Thank you, Courtney, as always. Very
Yeah.
informative.
Thank you.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining me, ladies. Have a lovely evening.
You too.
And I hope to see you next time.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Did I leave? Guess I did.